See if I can get to my first slide. All right, I think we have a couple more people coming online, but thank you for joining me and spending your Friday morning, almost Friday afternoon with me. I think we're going to have a good time. We are going to tour around Washington, D.C. So I'm sure many of you are in Washington and living in Washington, but maybe not getting around the city as much as you used to. So maybe I'll take you to some places you haven't been, or I'm probably going to take you to places you have been, but haven't been in a while, or at least in a couple months. But all right, well, let's get started. I think we have 15 people in. We probably will have some more folks coming in. But again, just welcome all of you to this ABetterU Skills Institute. What my plans are for the hour or plus that we have together is to just take you through Washington, D.C. a little bit, take you through some of the corridors that have revitalized and maybe gentrified, depending on how you want to frame it. And we are going to sort of think through how we can do equitable development. And by equitable development, I mean redevelopment in low-income spaces that actually benefits long-term low-income people. And I think in our country, we do a pretty good job of place-based development, but we usually redevelop the place and displace people who live there. So we're going to talk about how to do redevelopment that brings opportunities into low-income spaces that betters the life chances for low-income people. So I would say, please ask questions. You know, this should be a dialogue among us. I mean, this is a Friday morning, and we should just enjoy the time, keep it laid back, and again, feel free to mute yourselves and ask a question as I go through this, but I'm definitely going to leave time for a discussion at the end as well. So anyway, let's get started. So let's see if I can move my slides around a little bit. There we go. I just want to start by just letting you know a little bit about me. You know, I'm a professor at American University in the Department of Public Administration and Policy. I also head the Metropolitan Policy Center, which does a lot of research. I would say 75–80% of what we do looks at neighborhood change that is happening in the Washington, D.C. region. But we do have studies that are sort of nationwide and even some international studies as well. I put up on this slide 3 of the books that I have published, and I wrote a book called Race, Class, and Politics in the Cappuccino City, which was about the redevelopment of Shaw and U Street. We're going to talk about that community, but I've also studied New York City and Chicago and looked at the revitalization in my 2008 book, The New Urban Renewal, happening in Harlem and Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. And I also have an edited volume with Sabia Prince, which sort of brings together over 20 authors who are writing or were writing and are studying the Washington, D.C. region. So I've studied some of the most historic Black communities in the country. And I'll be quite upfront right now, I'm a white guy. And most people sort of say, wait a minute, what's this white professor studying these types of communities, and why? Why does he do it? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how what I do relates to my upbringing and my background. I grew up in a suburb north of New York City, about an hour north. It was a segregated white suburb, middle to upper income. Town was 30,000. It had 5 Black families in the town, so very, very segregated. But I went to play ball in high school. I made varsity as a freshman and had aspirations of, you know, playing big time Division I basketball, maybe making it on to the NBA. That did not happen. I didn't play big time Division I. I went to Colgate, which, as you guys know, is in the Patriot League. Solid league, but, you know, it isn't UNC at Chapel Hill. But in high school, I traveled for 2 years down from Somers, New York, down to Harlem. I joined a team based out of Riverside Church, which is in West Harlem. And this is Harlem at the time coming off the crack epidemic. This is Harlem in the late 80s, early 90s. And, you know, I really learned about the inner city environment, not from books, but by being in that environment. So I played on 116th Street, 155th Street. I played in the Rutger League. And if there are any basketball fans out there online with me, you know that the Rutger League and the Goodman League in Washington, D.C. are probably the two best outdoor summer basketball leagues in the country. But, you know, it really opened my eyes to the inner city environment. I mean, most of my teammates and friends, they were from Harlem or they were from the Bronx. And, you know, seeing the boarded up brownstones, seeing the crack vials on the street, seeing the drug dealers, it was one thing seeing all that, but then hearing from my teammates and friends about how that environment was impacting their lives had a big influence on my ultimate career. And so my research is very personal, because when I'm doing my research, it's about trying to build a better environment for my friends and teammates. So trying to get resources into segregated, divested inner city areas, again, I try to do it very objectively, but I do it is all undergirded by my passion and my background, and the time that I spent in high school in Harlem. All right, so what are we going to cover today? What I want to do here is talk a little bit about the extent that DC is gentrifying. And we're going to do that by sort of walking through a little background on overall what's happening in the city today, but then we're going to do a deeper dive into Shaw, the U Street area, and also the Wharf, which is in Southwest. And you know, we're going to go over sort of what are some of the drivers of gentrification, but so what are some of the consequences and what are some of the concerns. Then I kind of want to end with what are the implications for you guys? You know, what does all this mean, and how can you contribute beyond all your studies and everything you're doing at American, but contribute to the broader context of Washington, D.C.? All right, I think we need to start by just having a common understanding and framework when I throw around the term gentrification. I'm sure that, you know, if I opened up the mics and asked you guys, what does gentrification mean? We'd get 15, maybe 20 different answers, because it means something different to people. Sometimes it means race. Sometimes it means class. Sometimes it means the movement of people. Some people think it means the movement of capital. But gentrification is this term that's thrown around all the time, and everybody has a different understanding of what the term really is. So I want to just let you know what I think it is. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right definition. It's just one of many definitions. But Ruth Glass was the first person. She was a UK scholar. She came up with the term in 1964. And for her, it was when upper income people, middle income people moved into a low income space. And when they did that, it triggered the displacement of the low income people. So for her, displacement was tied to the term gentrification. Also for her, it was class based, in that, you know, when she was studying UK, studying London in the 1960s, most of the working class communities were white, and the upper income people who were moving into these places at the time were also white. So there's a real sort of a class sort of changeover in the community. But when you take that into the context of the United States, we have whopping racial disparities in income and wealth. And when we talk about a low income community having an influx of upper income people, it usually means upper income whites moving into a low income Black or Latino space. But it doesn't always mean that. So there is, you know, this white-led gentrification I have there, but there's also been Black-led gentrification, where upper-income African Americans are moving into a low-income Black space. When I studied Harlem's redevelopment in the late 90s and Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago, that's exactly what was happening. Very few white people moving in to a low-income Black space. It was upper-income African Americans. Also, you could have multiracial gentrification. Shaw U Street in the 1990s actually had an influx of upper income whites, Blacks, and Hispanics coming in. That changed in the 2000s because it mainly was young white millennials moving into that space, but you could have multiracial gentrification. So again, mostly in the US, it means white people moving into low-income Black or spaces that are have people of color, but not always. The other thing I wanted to add is, for me, gentrification is when upper income people and investments come into a low-income space. And when you'll see when we get to the wharf's redevelopment didn't have a big influx of young white millennials at first. It had an influx of billions of dollars. So it's could be upper income people or investments, and then those investments redevelop the space and attract upper income people. All right, let's sort of look at the context of gentrification since the 1990s in the US. And, I just had this here. This is from Governing Magazine in 2015. And they looked at the top 50 cities population-wise in the United States. And they found that low-income census tracts, about 9% of them gentrified in the 1990s. But when we get to the 2000s, between 2000 and 2010, it went from 9% of the low-income census tracts in cities, top 50 cities, gentrifying to 20%. So there's been a vast increase in the amount of gentrification that is happening in our country nationwide. Here you see a depiction of the gentrification spatial locations around the country, and this is from 2000 to 2013. You can see the big circles are where 51 to 144 census tracts that are low income gentrified, meaning they had an influx of upper income people, and the property values went up and the education levels in those communities went up. And one thing I want you to take away from this is, some people used to think, oh, gentrification in the United States, that's just an East Coast and West Coast thing. That just happens in New York, happens in San Francisco. Yes, it used to happen predominantly on the coast, but you can see Chicago, Minneapolis, Denver, Dallas, Houston, New Orleans, Atlanta. Gentrification is not an East Coast, West Coast thing anymore. It is happening all over the country, and it is in particularly happening much more frequently in the southern cities than it has happened ever before. So it is definitely, but also I want you to know, one of the big, red or pinkish circles is Washington, D.C. All right, so contemporary Washington. One thing is that a lot of scholars sort of passed up studying Washington. It was a sleepy federal government town, right? It was also dominated by the federal government. If the federal government decided to inject capital into the city would boom. If the federal government was increasing in terms of its employment with jobs, the city would develop. If the government paused, and the city would pause. That is true still to a certain extent, but not as much as it used to be, because Washington, D.C. is much more than a federal city. It has an advanced service sector economy. It's always had that. We never had a lot of manufacturing here. But the advanced service sector economy is now the booming economy of cities in the United States and around the world. So what happens in Washington with its development patterns could be very telling of what's going to happen with advanced service sector economies around the country and around the world. Also, I talked about the diversity of the economy. It used to be that the federal government dominated, but the federal government now outsources a lot of its functions. And now, things happen as part of the federal government, but it's not federal employees. It may be App Associates. It may be McKinsey. But there is so much private sector employment related to the federal government that is in the DC region now. But the economy is much more a mix of public and private sector employment opportunities, which makes the DC economy much more like other city and regional economies around the country. Also, DC has a robust back to the city movement. Between 2000 and 2010, there was a 5.2% population increase. Over 50,000 people came into the city, mostly young white millennials. But there is this back to the city movement that is impacting DC and related to the gentrification and growth patterns that we're going to look at and that we have looked at. All right, and you know, with this back to the city movement, there is widespread gentrification. So, no matter how you define or operationalize gentrification, it's going to rank 1, 2, or 3 as the top gentrified cities in the United States. So, what this basically shows, this is the governing magazine look, but like Portland, Oregon is the top ranked gentrified place because almost 60% of its low income census tracts gentrified since 2000. Washington, D.C., 52%, which is crazy. So let's sort of look at that. And what does that look like spatially? So here we have the explosion of gentrification that happens in DC. So in the 1990s, only 5% of the low-income census tracts, those are the ones in blue, gentrified. But in the 2000s, like I said, about 52% of the low-income census tracts gentrified. So you can sort of see on the map to the right that these areas, you know, surround sort of the central business district. They sort of go up and around northeast to, you know, southeast and also northeast, and then also southwest. The area that I have encircled is the Shaw U Street area. So now I'm going to sort of take you into Shaw U Street, and we're going to sort of unpack some of the drivers and consequences of the redevelopment that has happened there, at least since the 2000s. But let me just take a pause before I go into that. Any questions or comments on some of the stuff I just covered? No? Nobody's?
Hi, Professor. There are actually some comments in the chat.
Okay. All right, let me see if I can.
Not from myself, but.
Thank you. The one thing, when I have my slides up, it is kind of hard for me to see the chat. So
read the questions if you want.
That would be very helpful, Lisa. Thank you.
Okay, this is from Catherine. How did they define gentrification? And the people who collected data is who she's referring to.
Yeah, excellent question. So the charts and figures that I'm showing, the rankings that I just showed, you know, I showed a NCRC 2019 study and then the Governing Magazine 2015 study. And they basically use almost the exact same definition of gentrification. And they use a definition that was defined by Lance Freeman, who's a gentrification scholar at Columbia University, a good friend of mine and one of the top gentrification scholars in the world. And the way he defined it is that you have to have a low income tract. So it has to be a tract that falls at the 40th percentile or below for the city or for the region on property values or rents. So you have a low income. Then you look at sort of time two. And at time two, you have to have a property value increase. You have to have an increase in the number of, or the percent of people that have over a BA or higher. And you also have to have a rise in the median household income. So if you have all three of those things happening in a low income tract, then it is determined that that tract has gentrified. But like I said, there are many scholars that use different definitions. But you know, in terms of understanding what is the definition that is related to the charts and figures I just showed you, that's it. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, the next question is from Nick. What is the impact of COVID working remotely having on Back to the City movement?
That is a great question. I want to answer that because I was on a panel last night where the same exact question was asked. I also got a call from a Washington Post reporter yesterday who asked me the same exact question, but I'm going to hold that. I wrote it down. We're going to get to that towards the end because we have a lot of stuff to get through. And if I start talking about that, we won't get through the presentation. But it's a great question. And COVID is impacting things, but maybe not as much as you think. And when we get to the wharf, I'll talk about that. And at the end, I'll definitely come back to it. All right, Lisa, you want to maybe one other question?
That was our last one for now.
Okay.
I'll let you know when we have more. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Very good questions, by the way. All right. So, what's going on in Shaw U Street? All right. Usually at this point of the time I ask, and I can see some of you, I can't see all of you, but how many of you, from the ones I can see, how many of you have been to Shaw U Street? All right. Yeah, so everybody just about. So, yeah. So it's a community that I'm sure you're familiar with. This is where a lot of people go out in the city. It has 14th Street, which is Restaurant Row. I mean, you know, U Street, 7th Street, 9th Street. I mean, this is where things are popping and happening in the city. Uh, and this community has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years. I mean, also, it's important that we sort of talk about, before we get into it, I'm just going to flip over some of the things that, you know, this is in Northwest DC, but this area was the Harlem of Washington, DC. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it was known as Black Broadway because of the entertainment that was on 14th Street or also on U Street. This is where Duke Ellington lived. This is where Langston Hughes lived. This is also the community that Elaine Locke, who was a professor at Howard University, came up with the philosophy of the New Negro. And the New Negro becomes the philosophy of the Harlem Renaissance. Elaine Locke moves from this area and moves up to Harlem to basically galvanize scholars, literary figures, you know, artists into Harlem. So, but that philosophy of Black racial uplift, it was defined here in Washington, D.C. So, you know, the Shaw U Street, historic Black community, but after the 1968 riots, after Martin Luther King is assassinated, 14th Street burns, U Street burns, 7th Street burns. And a lot of the Black middle class that is living in the area move out. They move to Prince George's County. And the community becomes very impoverished. A lot of subsidized housing goes up in the burnt out structures along 7th Street. And in 1980, the community is about 80% African American. But by 2010, the community is only 30% African Americans, and whites become the majority population in the community. If you want to live in this community now, you better come with $1 million at least to get a row home. Rents can be 1 bedrooms, 3,500, and that's going to be kind of a low, not a low income, but it's going to be a low in terms of how much it costs. There are some 1 bedrooms going for $5,000 a month. There is a 2-bedroom penthouse near the O Street Market on 7th that was advertised for $12,000 a month. So these are incredibly high prices for rent and for real estate, but the community has changed dramatically. So here you see sort of this before and after. This is the AMP carry out on your left, right? Low cost soul food kind of on the go. You see people hanging out. I took this picture in 2010. And then to the right, you see P14. P14, I took this picture in 2014. And I think this sort of symbolizes the changes that have happened in this community. You know, AMP carryout went to become P14, and P14 is an upscale neo-American bistro where you can get your, you know, $28 foie gras lobster burger. This is where people used to, right? But we don't really do it anymore, is what brunching on Sundays and just hung out for most of the day. And so young white millennials that have moved into Shaw U Street and have moved into the city, they go to P14. So the transformation from AMP carryout to P14 sort of symbolizes the transformation that took place in the Shaw U Street neighborhood. But I wanted to say that Shaw U Street is still, I mean, probably not anymore, but of 2010, it was 30% African Americans. Most of the African Americans that still live in this community live in some form of subsidized housing. You know, there wasn't complete displacement out of this community because actually Washington, D.C. has some of the best affordable housing policies in the nation. D.C. has a housing affordable housing trust fund. That's $100 million a year. Most states don't have an affordable housing trust fund that big. Some of that trust fund money was used to redevelop this building, 1330. And across the street, there's another multifamily affordable housing unit on 7th. So we just got to think about that affordable housing did keep some people in place amidst the gentrification. But as I talk about in the Shaw U Street book, just because we've got upper income and lower income people of different races and ethnicities living together doesn't necessarily mean low income people are going to substantially benefit from living in that environment. But it is noteworthy that a lot of the people who remain who are of color in Shaw U Street are there because subsidized housing, or at least some of it, was preserved. What's interesting about the Shaw U Street area is I talked about its incredible Black history, and that history is being used, commodified, and branded to market the community. And I think that that's something that's really new, interesting in the context of US racial history and neighborhood history. Usually when a neighborhood was branded Black, it led to white flight. Now, certain neighborhoods, when they're branded Black in a particular way, and we see a picture there of Duke Ellington, and next to, row homes that are for sale, probably going for at least $1 million. But the Black history is embedded in this community. It's in the walking trails for Black history. It's in the restaurants like Marvin, which is on 14th Street, that pays homage to Marvin Gaye. Who, by the way, didn't grow up or live in Shaw U Street, but did grow up in Washington, D.C. But anyway, the fact that the Black history, the Black Broadway, the jazz, the historic legacy of this community is something that a lot of people recognize and know when they come to Shaw U Street. But while that history is being used, commodified to market the community to young white millennials, long-term Black residents are having a difficult time staying in the community. So here we've got a picture of Wanda Henderson. Wanda Henderson is a 4th generation Washingtonian. She had a hair shop that was on U Street on 11th, and it became too expensive with the redevelopment. So she moved her hair shop over to 7th Street, and she was there for a while. But then that area started around the Howard Theater. It developed with Progression Place. And her bay was being revitalized. And when it was being revitalized, she had to go. So she got displaced. So it's not only about, we talked a lot about residential displacement and trying to prevent that when gentrification happens, but there's also this notion of small Black businesses. Will they be able to stay? And, when we think about hair shops in African-American communities, it's not just a business, it's part of the culture, it's part of the politics of the community. And when a place like Wanda's gets displaced, it is a sense of cultural displacement and loss that is happening in this community. So, again, while the Black history is being used in a certain way to commodify and sell units, which is related to rising property values, small Black business owners are being booted from the community. Also, I came up with this term of diversity segregation. When you're on the street, and again, most of you have said you've been to Shaw U Street, but it feels very diverse racially, economically, in terms of sexual orientation, right? You have all these different people from all walks of life on the street at one time. But when you start to go into the social fabric of the community, when you go into the churches, when you go into the beer gardens, when you go into the recreation centers, it starts to segregate. And a lot of the sort of mechanisms that we thought low-income people would benefit when economic revitalization came to their neighborhood was through social interactions. It was through, speaking with and talking to and becoming friends and familiar with people moving into the community that had access to resources. But what you really see in this community is a set of diversity that's there on the street, but you also see segregation. So as Wanda gets booted out, who comes in? Elizabeth Taylor, and that's Docha, and Docha Beer Garden. And I'm sure many of you have been to Docha or Dacha. But you can see there's a guy there, who's looking in, who probably feels that that space is not for him. And just up the street, you've got another mural not too far of Marvin Gaye. So now the murals are Marvin Gaye and also Elizabeth Taylor. And the murals represent the changing notion of the community. But I think it also is symbolic of the micro level segregation that is happening. And I think that micro level segregation is related to the lack of more benefits for low-income people who are able to remain in the subsidized housing in this community. So I will take a pause there because we are going to go from Shaw U Street over to a totally different economic revitalization that is happening along Southwest Washington at the wharf. But I want to again take a pause. I'll look at my time. We're doing fine on time, but to see if there are any questions. I'm sure there are a bunch of questions because, I spent 5-6 years doing research in this community and tried to present an entire book project in about 10 minutes. So I just scratched the surface on what transpired in this community, but I just do want to take a pause for a couple questions before we head to the wharf.
Okay, I have a question about the housing policies.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that there's some of the best housing policies in DC. And the question is, why are there so many homeless people? Or why does DC have so many homeless people?
No, it's a great question. And the reason is that even with such robust housing, affordable housing policies compared to other cities, DC has such an affordable housing need. The need dwarfs the amount of money that is available for affordable housing. And that's why we have a homeless population in the way that we do. The other thing is that the gentrification is related in part to the affordable housing crisis that we have, but also just the homeless issue. That in the Shaw U Street area, there were homeless shelters. Most of them have been, they've been bought out, they've been revitalized, and now they are luxury apartments. So some of the affordable housing infrastructure for the homeless was in Shaw U Street, and now it is no more. But for the city as a whole, it's really about the fact that there's such an affordable housing need, but yet the money isn't quite enough. I mean, DC provides vouchers. So out of the operating budget for the city every year, they provide affordable housing vouchers for people. Most cities don't provide that. There's money from the federal government that comes for that, but DC actually supplements the money from the federal government. Again, the $100 million trust fund. Most states don't have that, let alone most cities. There's inclusionary zoning policies in Washington, D.C. There is, other policies that I don't have time to get into that other cities don't have, but DC also has just an incredible need because it has a bifurcated labor market. You've got a lot of affluent people in the city, but you also have a lot of poor people. When I talked about the diversity of DC's economy, it's an advanced service sector economy, and it pumps out a lot of high wage jobs and it pumps out a lot of low wage jobs. But the people who are on low wages don't earn enough to afford the housing stock that is here. So it makes it very difficult for low-income people, even working low-income people, to afford rents and in the city. So that it helps, I think, contextualize a little bit why, even with this robust affordable housing policy safety net, there still are a lot of homeless people in this city.
Is the DC Affordable Housing Trust Fund primarily funded by local government or taxes, or the federal government / Congress? And that's from Mac.
Yeah, really good question. So the bulk of the funds that come into Washington, D.C. for affordable housing is from the federal government. So it is money that comes into the DC Housing Authority, the Public Housing Authority, to manage public housing in the city. Also the Section 8 vouchers that come in also to the DC Housing Authority that provides a rent subsidy for people who don't live in traditional public housing, but live in private market affordable housing, but their rents get subsidized by the federal government. Then a small percentage of those subsidies for the Housing Choice Voucher Program come from the DC operating budget. But the $100 million per year for the Affordable or Housing Trust Fund does come 100% from tax revenues that are generated locally and go into the operating budget and revenue structure for the city. So the bulk of the funds for affordable housing come from the federal government, but the DC government supplements that with some of its own resources, and more so than most cities around the country.
Okay, we have a question from Alexis. Do new businesses hire people who are from the communities they are entering, creating economic opportunities for the current residents?
Yeah, I will take a pause on that one because we'll get into that a little bit with the wharf. So I want to make sure that with the time that we have, we get through the wharf. But oftentimes businesses, new businesses, do not hire locally. And that can be problematic. But anyway, let's hold on that question. Now we've got two questions we'll hold more towards the end, but I think it'll be answered as we move forward with the presentation. But really, again, great questions.
We have one more question from Courtney.
Sure.
Do you have any stat about or statistic about what percentage of DC's low-income population is POC?
Is what? What's it?
POC. And
What is POC?
Courtney, you can unmute if you want to chime in, please.
Or somebody else may know what POC is, so they could chime in too. Or maybe she's going to write in what that means.
Yeah, they put in chat that it's people of color.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you. All right. We'll hold on that, but disproportionately, the low-income population is people of color, and it is majority African-American in Washington, D.C. So that one I can answer pretty quickly. All right, so let's get you guys to the wharf. We went from northwest south to southwest. You can see on the left there's Washington. There's the sort of red box. That's kind of approximately where the area is in southwest Washington, where the wharf is located. And then you can see on the right, it kind of gets in there a little closer. And that's the area that we are going to be talking about with redevelopment that has happened there in the last 16 years. All right, so here we have a picture of phase one of the wharf. But what I've written there is more, the bullet points are about the entire development, which is going in phase one. And phase two is actually, if you get down there or live around there, you can see the cranes are up. And phase two is being developed, but it's 27 acres, almost a mile along the southwest waterfront. It will be almost 3.4 million square feet of residential, hotel, office, retail, restaurants, and public space. It also will have mixed income residences, so it'll be upper income, but also some moderate income housing. You know, over 10 acres of parks. I don't know, I went down there with my son and daughter. We've been kayaking down there, 4 different piers. I'm sure some of you have gone to the Anthem as well, which is a 6,000 seat concert venue. But it is a total transformation for that area. So let's look at sort of some of the research questions. So I got a grant at the Metropolitan Policy Center to look at the Southwest redevelopment, and we really ask questions, what is related to the economic challenges to financing the wharf? because again, it was $2.5 billion. It is one of the largest redevelopments in Washington, D.C.'s history. So how the heck did that happen? You just don't get $2.5 billion overnight. But also, how are the public resources? So over 300 million were given from the DC government to the developers of the wharf, and they utilized that 300 million to get the rest of the financing. So what were some of the challenges with the financing and the economic growth sort of outcomes, but also, was it socially inclusive? You know, the Southwest has this history of redevelopment that I'm sure some of you are aware of, but in the late 1940s, early 1950s, thousands and thousands of people were displaced from the Southwest area. So we wanted to understand how the prior displacement related to concerns of displacement and inclusion in the contemporary development. And we also wanted to know how low-income people who live just around the wharf in public housing perceive the wharf and whether they feel like they're being included and would utilize the development. So, you know, it was really a case study. We spent a lot of time doing participant observation down there. And we did a lot of key stakeholder interviews with business owners, with public housing residents, with the developers. We interviewed just a whole host of people that were related to this project. And we did a lot of archival work in terms of city documents, newspaper articles to come up with the findings here. Here I just have, I'm going to start to go a little quickly because I don't want to run out of time and I want to leave time for questions. But here you can just see it almost took 16, it's probably going to take 17 years for this development. A development like this takes a long time to develop. The other thing is that this development, which is crazy, has had to go through 2 recessions, right? We had the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009. When that happened, one of the key developers had to drop out because they went bankrupt, and then a new developer had to come in and partner with another developer to get the financing for phase 1. But now phase 2 is being built, and it's being built in another recession. So these deals take a long time to come to fruition, but the other part is that it is kind of amazing that the wharf has happened within the context of 2 huge economic recessions. The other thing I talked briefly, you know, about the historic context of what happened in this community. So, you know, there's the waterfront on the left before redevelopment, and then there is it on the right after the old urban renewal redevelopment. And you can see that the community was wiped out. Look at the density on the map on the left. Those are all homes. They're gone. So there was just a huge displacement, which almost was 99% of the people who were displaced were people of color. So there is a real history of development that disproportionately harms African Americans in this space. All right, and when you kind of, you know, fast forward from the 1950s to the 2000 period, again, just a revisit to the contemporary redevelopment context, we've already looked at this map, and you can see sort of, if you look at, you know, down in Southwest, you'll see those blue areas. Now, this area was gentrifying in the 2000s, but compared to the other places in DC, I think the city thought it was an underutilized space because they weren't maximizing what they thought were property values that could be garnered with redevelopment along the waterfront. So there was this whole move to clean up the Anacostia and Potomac rivers and to do redevelopment that you can see. I mean, I'm sure you've been to the Navy Yard. I'm sure you've been to the baseball stadium, Buzzards Points, even, you know, in Anacostia right now. Everywhere along the waterfront now in Washington is redeveloping. So the city had a lot of plans to reclaim the waterfront, and the wharf is just one part of the overall plan with redevelopment along the water. So to get this to happen, it was a private-public partnership where actually a lot of the land down there along the waterfront was controlled by the federal government. So 3 acts of Congress had to happen to actually transfer the land and the building and the water rights. First from the federal government to the city government, but then the city government transferred all of it to the 2 developers for the wharf. So this was really unprecedented in terms of development history, where you've got Congress having to act, then deploying resources to the DC government, then the DC government giving it to Hoffman, who was sort of the lead developer through the entire transaction. But anyway, so land being transferred, and you'll see that the worth of the land and how much it was transferred is pretty unbelievable. So here's the public financing for that wharf. There was tax increment financing, which is a local financing tool where bonds were floated by the DC government, and then the resources for those bonds were given to the developer. So it was like 200 million. It was the biggest tax increment financing deal in the city's history. Also, all of the land that was transferred from the federal government to the local government was given to the developers for a 99-year land lease, which was worth almost $100 million, which they were given to for $1. They actually made them pay $1. Right? Couldn't believe it. It's like, why don't you just give them to them for free? All right, we'll make them pay $1. And then the city also did some other things in terms of soft cost redevelopment costs, which the whole deal came to 300 million. For phase 1 of the financing, you can see that P and Hoffman put in a good amount of money. It's actually unknown how much one of the lead real estate developers put in, but if you do some calculation, it's a lot. It's in the upper 50 millions, but we've got money coming from PSP Investments, which is a Canadian private equity coming in. So international money as well as domestic money came in to do the financing of the wharf. The other thing is that in addition to the tax increment financing district, also a business improvement district was lofted, and you can see all the areas in red are part of that business improvement district. All commercial businesses have to pay a levy and a tax that goes to the Southwest Business Improvement District, and then that district redeploys it to make a business-friendly environment. They hire security, they have transportation that gets people from the mall down to the waterfront. But one of the things I want you to notice is the black box towards the bottom. That is the Greenleaf home. So there's a public housing project that has some of the poorest residents in the city living in very close proximity to all the investments that are happening along the waterfront. And a key question is, will those people be able to remain? And will they benefit at all from all of the redevelopment that is happening there? So there were some benefits for the entire community with this development at the wharf. There were public amenities, talked about the parks. Anyone can go there. You may be monitored by a private security firm, but nonetheless, anyone can go on the wharf and enjoy the parks that are there. Also, in terms of, there was a question about workforce. So yes, there was a deal struck that low and moderate income people would be hired to do some of the construction jobs at the wharf. But what was really interesting about this deal is the wharf is in Ward 6. The deal that was cut allowed or preferenced people that were in Ward 7 and 8. Now, Ward 7 and 8 are dominated by people of color. They are some of the lowest income wards and sections of the city. This is east of the Anacostia River, but I thought it was so interesting and kind of ridiculous that people who are low income of color living in Greenleaf were not prioritized to work at the wharf. Residents who are low income in other sections of the city were prioritized. So just an interesting sort of deal that was cut. Now also affordable housing, that 300 million that came from the city government, the city did sort of mandate that affordable housing, and I'll put it in quotes because you will see it's not all affordable housing, but that some affordable housing was built along the wharf. So let's look at that mixed income housing in phase one. So there are about 870 units of housing. Most of those units, as you can see, are market rate. So there are some affordable housing that are at 30 to 60% of AMI. That's area median income. And then workforce housing at 100 to 120 AMI. But you can see what the annual incomes are for you to afford the units that are affordable in workforce. So yes, there were some that were available for what we might see as low-income people, but most of the units, the workforce units and the market rate units, are for pretty wealthy people. So, you know, my estimation is that there was some thought about doing affordable housing, but the thing that there wasn't thought about is how would the $2.5 billion investment along the wharf affect people that live in Greenleaf, or affect other low-income people, because Greenleaf isn't the only low-income housing structure near the wharf. But was there anything done to protect those people and their housing? No. But there was some affordable housing built on site. So there is an equity question here in terms of, will low-income residents in Southwest be able to remain over time? I can tell you, as phase one was being finished, the DC Public Housing Authority put out a plan to redevelop Greenleaf. And I've been in DC long enough to know when redevelopment plans come out, even if they have the right of return written into them, which the Greenleaf plan has, it also says that the developer needs to do one-for-one replacement. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? There's a public housing project in Anacostia, Berry Farms. Berry Farms had the one-for-one replacement, the right of return, but all the Berry Farm residents are displaced now. And the likelihood that they'll come back is very unlikely. Author Cappers is another public housing project that was located near the baseball stadium. Before the baseball stadium got redeveloped, most of those residents have been displaced. Some have come back. So there is a real question as to whether Greenleaf residents, when the redevelopment occurs at their development, will they be allowed to come back? And the timing is interesting that, you know, Greenleaf project has been there for a long time. How is it that once phase one is finished, now the DC Housing Authority decides to redevelop Greenleaf? They're doing it because the land where Greenleaf sits now is gold. It is worth a lot of money. And likely the DC Housing Authority will sell it to a for-profit developer who will redevelop that land and make a ton of money. The DC Housing Authority will also probably make a good amount of money because they will sell the land and then they will use the proceeds to rehab other public housing around the city. But what does that mean for the Greenleaf residents? It means that they likely will be gone. So we've got a few minutes here. Some of the findings for the wharf is that the land assembly and transfer was critical to having it get executed and be accomplished. The 300 million or 200 million in TIF subsidies definitely helped to attract the private development to pull off it. The wharf's development is related, I didn't present on this, is really and somewhat related to the escalating property values that are happening in Southwest now. But whether it's equitable or not, we'll have to see. And it looks like there were some benefits in terms of the public parks, some affordable housing built on site along the waterfront, but it did very little to secure the housing for low-income people that live in close proximity to the waterfront. So, you know, when we take the two sort of developments, right, what happened in Shaw U Street, what's happening along the waterfront at the wharf, I think the city really needs to take a step back and think about how to reaffirm a right to the city. The picture that you see is there's the Anacostia Smithsonian Community Museum. There is an exhibit that I think is still going on of 6 different neighborhoods that have changed over time, and the organizing that took place in those communities to ensure that low-income people benefited and had a right to stay in the city. And and mostly in the 20th century. Well, in the 21st century, we need to revisit that. We need to think about that, because with all this development, with all this gentrification that's going on, there is a set of displacement. And, you know, again, I told you all that my thought about redevelopment is equitable development. Bring resources into low-income spaces so it benefits the lives of low-income people. And if low-income people are being displaced from areas that are getting resources, they are unlikely to benefit. But we've also talked about, even with Shaw, when they stay in place, unless we do things to facilitate the wheels of social integration, and there isn't going to be a big benefit. So I think what the city needs to think about is, one, preserving affordable housing. That is like square one. If we don't preserve affordable housing where gentrification is taking place, then we'll just have displacement. And then there truly can be no benefit, or very small benefit. But we also got to go beyond affordable housing, and we need to think about minimizing political and cultural displacement. I didn't talk a lot about the political, but I did mention the cultural displacement that is going on. But the city, instead of giving, you know, the developers $300 million in subsidy, why didn't they give some subsidy to small mom and pop businesses in Southwest? Why didn't some subsidy go to a person like Wanda in Northwest Washington in Shaw U Street? That might have allowed her to stay and benefit from the revitalization that was happening in that community. So we got to think about the residential side, but we also need to think about the commercial side. And then if we are able to keep businesses and people in place, we've got to think about social integration. We've been segregated, and there's been a set of discrimination and mistrust in our country for so long. If you have upper income people and low income people living in close proximity to one another, you can't just expect that magically they will bump into one another and benefit one another. We've got to do things like build third spaces that bring people together in communities so that they start to recognize that they have more common interests than dissimilarity in these situations. So those are just some of the things that I would recommend. And then the last thing I'll end on before we open it up for the last 15 minutes for questions is what are the implications for all of you? I mean, you're at AU, and how can you participate in the city to ensure that equitable development happens? I just put, you know, some of the groups that the Metropolitan Policy Center has interacted with and engaged with, that we work with, that try to organize people in communities that are going through the gentrification process to ensure that long-term community members get benefits. So Southwest DC Action in Southwest, check them out. They've got their website. They have a whole equitable development plan, and they are working hard with Greenleaf residents to make sure that they don't get displaced. Empower DC is doing the same thing. They are working with residents at Greenleaf, and they're also working with former residents at Berry Farm. The United Planning Organization, a huge organization that was founded in the 60s, is also doing a lot of advocacy, and I've worked closely with them. One DC, it's organizing neighborhood equity. They are based in Shaw. They are the ones that struck the first community benefits agreements in Washington, DC. So remember I talked about Wanda and I said how she got displaced? Well, she actually came back. She came back to the spot where she had her hair shop, and she came back because One DC organized all of the subsidized residents that were up on 7th Street that utilized Wanda's hair shop. And they negotiated with the developer so that Wanda was able to get a subsidized bay so that she's paying below market rate rent for her commercial space for 5 years. But the 5 years is just about up, and Wanda may ultimately be displaced again. But these are just some of the organizations that you could volunteer and work with to try to help bring about equitable development in the nation's capital. So with that, I've given you a tour of the overall context of redevelopment and gentrification in the city. We've done a brief touch on what's happening in Shaw U Street and maybe a little bit deeper dive into what is happening at the wharf. And now I'll just open up to all of you to take some more questions. But I do know we still have the COVID question. So I can start with that. But Lisa, if you could just let me know, do we have till 12:15?
Correct. We have until 12:15.
All right, which gives us 14 minutes. So I'll start with the COVID question. I think it's a really good question. I mean, we are in a huge economic downturn. We also are in the middle of a pandemic, which is related to the economic downturn. And, you know, some people are speculating that people are going to start to leave cities, right? That the real estate markets are going to soften because people are going to bounce out to the suburbs because they want more space where it's easier to social distance. And people think that the gentrification engine that I just talked about in the 2000s to, 2019 is going to stall. And I think it will take a pause. But, if you look at the wharf phase 2, the cranes are already up. Buzzards Point, there are cranes there. You're going to start to see more cranes in Anacostia. So the people with money, when I say the people, I'm talking about investors with big money, international investors. This pandemic is not, an economic recession is not hurting them. The stock market is doing great. So there are real estate investment trusts that are just looking for places to invest. They will invest and the gentrification engine will move on. Now the market may soften up a bit, but you know what? When we get a vaccine, which will probably happen in a year or two, and also likely, no matter who wins the presidential election, there'll be another $2 trillion that is injected into the United States economy. There's going to be a recession recovery. And people are going to come back to the city. So the gentrification engine may stall for a year or two or three. But the people with deep pockets and money and access to low interest loans are going to invest and they're going to continue to build. And then they're going to fill it up with people who come back in 2 to 3 years. I mean, think about all of you. You are scattered across the country, or you could be, because AU is doing online learning. You not being in DC may be softening up the real estate market and the rents may be going down slightly. But maybe in the spring, maybe in the fall, AU and all the universities across Washington, DC are going to open up back on campus. And so the real estate market will bolster again. And the same dynamics that were in play before the pandemic will be in place after. And again, think about the Great Recession. From 2007 to 2009, things in DC and New York slowed down a little bit. But after 2009 and 2010 onward to 2019, the gentrification, snowball and the engine just rolled right over a lot of people. And I think that's what's going to happen in about a 2.5 year period in Washington and in all the other cities that I showed you around the country where gentrification was moving pretty quickly in the 2000 to 2013 period. So I hope that answers, I mean, maybe it doesn't fully answer the COVID question, but there are massive inequalities, and this pandemic and health epidemic is disproportionately affecting people of color with onset because of neighborhood and structural inequalities. People of color in DC and in other cities are more likely to be frontline workers, right? They have to be out and about in this pandemic, so they're likely to catch. Also, the hospital structure is not as good. The food delivery service in low-income communities, there's multiple reasons why low-income people are more susceptible to COVID. Also, people are dealing with death disproportionately. They're also dealt with unemployment disproportionately. So a lot of the low-income spaces in DC, there's an eviction moratorium until December 31st. But what happens when that gets lifted? People are going to get evicted. And you know who's going to come in? Big real estate investors to swoop up their properties and then wait for the return of the back to the city movement after we get a vaccine. So I think the prospects are pretty grim in terms of equitable development going forward after we recover from this pandemic and recession. All right, I know there's got to be some other questions, so fire them my way. So Lisa, go ahead if there are some, and feel free to just unmute.
Well, I actually have a question. Why aren't terms of redevelopment agreements enforced. If it's one for one, does that mean like people could stay and they're actually given the opportunity to stay? Like, why are doing
Lisa,
this?
that's a great question, because it's like, if into these redevelopment contracts it says one for one replacement, how are people being displaced? So how it happens is that they don't always specify the bedroom size or what is considered affordable to the person who's in the unit now. The unit that gets created may not be affordable for them. That's another point. The other point is that it's one for one of the unit, not of the people in the unit. So developers, with a lot of the redevelopment of public housing across the city, the federal government never stipulated, nor did the local government, saying that you had to create a unit for the person who's in the unit, right? So it's just create an affordable unit. But a lot of the development, when they are seeking to get new tenants for the new units, they have such strict screening that if you have a credit ding, if someone in your family has been arrested, you don't get into that unit. Also, the units might have been a 5-bedroom, might have been a 4-bedroom unit, but the unit that is replaced, it's a studio. So it never will fit. So one for one replacement happens, but not of the equivalent unit and not at the equivalent price point. And that's why many of the people who are living in the developments, they think they have the right of return, but after the deal is cut and they see the units that get put on the market, it's not a unit for them. Does that help you understand how, even with the right of return and the one for one replacement stipulation, still in the end can lead to a situation where the people who are living in those units actually really don't have the right?
Yes, and it also makes me think that it needs to be a lot more specific.
I agree with you. And for those of you who want to get involved in a fight like that, I would say Empower DC and One DC are both testifying in front of the city council and in front of the DC Housing Authority on this exact issue. So if you do care about this issue and want to get involved with a group who is pushing the council and the mayor on this issue, it is those two groups.
I think William might have a question. I see you're unmuted.
I will stop sharing my screen so now I can see all of you. So, and I can actually get to the chat now.
Professor, good afternoon.
Yep.
My name is Bill Taub, and I have a unique viewpoint for a number of reasons. What you're talking about, I live in Boston, and I've seen over the last 40 years in Boston. I lived in the South End when the gentrification began, and people would say to me, "You live where?" The neighborhood's changed a lot even since I left the neighborhood. But the other thing that gives me a unique position, and I clearly are a white man, but I am an investor and a co-founder of a minority-owned high-tech company here in Massachusetts. And it's been a very interesting struggle because what everybody says is true. Black founders are looked at very differently, and it's much harder for them to raise money. And we're going through it right now. And it's been an interesting journey. But what you've described and going on in DC is happening in Boston. And it's the same problem, the same issue of people being displaced and people with money finding neighborhoods. And I can remember when I lived in the South End in the 70s, I begged my parents to buy real estate in the South End, and they didn't listen. And where I lived was nice, but that townhouse is probably worth $3 or $4 or $5 million today. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, William, thank you for your comments. And, you know, after I finished at the University of Chicago, and then I had a year fellowship that I did at Harvard, and I
Mm.
didn't live in Cambridge. I
we-
didn't live on the South End, but I lived by Northeastern because that's all I could afford. So I was kind of like living close to the Northeastern students. But my wife and I spent a lot of time walking the South End, and that area has totally changed.
Oh, it's so
Roxbury,
nice.
Dorchester. I mean, even it's going as far as Mattapan, like it's all the way down there, developing. And I would say though, Boston, the Dudley Street Initiative was one of the initiatives that utilized eminent domain to take back some of the land and develop affordable housing. So you're totally right. There's been a total racial and economic change down there on the South End. But a little bit further in the Dudley Street area, I mean, the Dudley Street Initiative is one of the ways. And people always ask me, like, what's the mechanism that actually help people stay in place? And I always point to the Dudley Street Initiative, and I say it's very hard to get land and to do land banking, but that area was able to do it, and it is a success. So there is sort of a glimmer of hope with some of the work that has been done in Boston.
Just to say one thing, Dudley Square is no longer called Dudley Square. They changed the name to Nubian Square. And I can remember, because I worked for a newspaper, community newspaper company, I would go into neighborhoods that people that look like us wouldn't dare go into. And I used to play basketball, and I'd be the only white guy in the 70s in the South End playing hoop. And everybody was like, what's he doing here? So thank you for bringing me up to date on DC.
Sure. So other questions? We are just about out of time, but maybe we have one more.
Okay, I'll go ahead. Thanks for a great presentation. So do you think that the statehood movement would move things in a more positive direction, or what hope is there for something that's happening more on the institutional level?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely for statehood. Having DC have a vote in Congress, I think, would be really important. But at the same time, some of the dynamics that are at play, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the reason that DC gives away some of its money to real estate development interests is because there isn't any other interests that fund political campaigns. And so whether DC has statehood, it'll still be the same real estate developers funding the congressional representatives and still be funding all of the city council member races. So some of the things I'm talking about may not be solved by stronger political representation for DC in Congress, but it can't hurt. And it's only a good thing to have that. I just wouldn't want to see that as being put as a panacea for some of these issues we're talking about. So, there's structural issues related to the DC's economy and also the political economy, I think, that relate to why we're seeing what we're seeing. But nonetheless, I think statehood would be amazing for it to happen. And I hope that it does.